Alasdair Allan, followed by Keith Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome this debate and the opportunity which it presents to reiterate this Parliament's support for achieving a carbon-neutral economy in Scotland. Now, as people never tire of hearing, I represent an island constituency which simultaneously contains some of the most environmentally sensitive land in the country and some of the greatest potential for renewable energy from both wind and the waves. And I can see and recognise the responsibility which we all have to get this transition to new energy sources right. The motion today, therefore, rightly focuses on a kind of environmental justice, as have a number of speakers today. The transition to a carbon-neutral economy in Scotland is one that we've already embarked upon as a country, and clearly huge challenges remain in getting there. But it's worth reflecting that Scottish carbon emissions have almost halved since 1990, and 49,000 jobs are now supported in our low-carbon sector. But it's also worth mentioning, too, in all due national modesty, some of the things that Scotland does on this front, which not all countries can lay claim to doing in reaching their targets. The Scottish Government has, for instance, further strengthened our commitment to achieving our carbon targets through domestic effort rather than via the alternative of paying other countries to make emission reductions on our behalf. And under our own legislation, Scotland will maintain a fair share of all international aviation and shipping emissions within our targets. And again, no other country does that. We'll maintain emissions from land use and forestry counting towards our targets, something, again, which is not something that's done everywhere. But perhaps what's worth saying about that is that Laurent Fabius, the architect of the Paris Agreement, has described Scotland's legislation as a concrete application of the Paris Agreement. So all that said, Presiding Officer, renewables and low-carbon energy will provide the foundation of our future energy system, offering Scotland a huge opportunity for economic and industrial growth. By 2030, Scotland aims to generate 50% of its overall energy consumption from renewable sources, and by 2050, we aim to have decarbonised our energy system almost completely. The Scottish Government is supporting low-carbon energy by establishing the Energy Investment Fund that will invest £20 million in low-carbon energy infrastructure, and this will promote the development of onshore wind in Scotland and across the UK, and I believe it will also help support the marine energy sector. It will make it easier to invest in local and small-scale renewables, which are so important to communities like my own, and to develop a bioenergy action plan, and will invest £60 million in the low-carbon infrastructure. So the Scottish Government and Scotland's political consensus more generally, I hope, clearly now want to ensure that we benefit fully from leading the global transition to low carbon. And so the decision, therefore, to appoint Professor Jim Skea to chair a commission on how the transition to carbon neutrality can help Scotland not just become greener but more prosperous is a very welcome one. It's a move that demonstrates, as if it needed to be demonstrated, the inseparability of environmental and economic progress for Scotland. Indeed, the Paris Climate Agreement itself recognises that just transition means moving to a low-carbon economy in a way that leaves nobody behind. That means not just the public sector, but the private one too, working together to consider ethical and sustainable supply chains. So I hope that we may soon see some other direct economic benefits, again, thinking of my own constituency, but other places too, benefits that will arise from Scotland's carbon agenda. I hope, for example, that we will soon be able to hear further news on the future of the Arnish construction yard in Lewis from its new owners, who have committed such attention to ensuring that the new work comes its way. The yard is certainly extremely well placed to carry out fabrication work for Scotland's offshore renewable industry, among other things. But the potential for this kind of work to provide apprenticeships, for instance, would be transformational in retaining young people in rural economies like my own. And the recently announced CNES 60 Foundation apprenticeships in conjunction with Skills Development Scotland are already a good example of a national-local government partnership which seeks to achieve just this in our island communities. And while there is still much potential in the North Sea oil industry, as a number of members have said today, there is also a potential for skills to be transferred from the oil sector into offshore renewables, providing both direct and supply chain jobs. Presiding Officer, although living in a windy place, as I do, brings with it an obvious energy source, this very climate is, of course, one of the reasons for a major problem locally, and that is fuel poverty. In the Western Isles, the recent figures show that fuel poverty stands at some 56% compared to a national average of 31%. Other island communities face similarly stark figures, although much is now being done to address the problem by providing insulation, particularly for older house types. Renewables are also helping to drive socio-economic benefits and community development, but are sometimes hampered by infrastructure constraints, which again make it even more important in the longer term that we see an interconnector enabling island renewables to be exported. I applaud the work that's being done by many organisations, not least in my own constituency, the University of the Highlands and Islands, and other institutions to make sure that technologies such as domestic combined heat and power, hydrogen ferries and better insulation are at the top of our agenda. But now we should make sure that energy and climate change policy is island-proofed and ensure that the potential of our island areas to make a national contribution to a carbon-neutral Scotland is fully recognised.